Hi, everybody. So today we're going to be going over the founding of the 13 English colonies and the various motivations and reasons behind the founding of those colonies. So today's objective is that the student will analyze the social, economic, and religious reasons behind the founding of the 13 colonies. So quick reminder, social means involving people, economic means involving how you make your money, and religious means involving worshiping of God. So previously we described the geography and the climate of the three colonial regions. So the first term we're going to need to look into is cash crops. And the way that I always remember it is grow them to sell them. You sell them, you get cash. So cash crops, those are crops that you cannot eat. So tobacco would be one example, cotton would be another example, indigo would be another example. All of these are crops that you cannot eat, but they are still valuable. So people will grow them so that they can sell them. Persecution means harassment or punishment by the government. And what's important is that when it comes to persecution, it involves not having committed a crime. So people can be punished by the government after they rob a bank or kill somebody or whatever. Persecution means that they have not committed a crime, but the government is extremely harassing them and extremely punishing them to the point that they are being thrown in prison, their property is being taken away, they're being killed. That's what persecution means. Puritans were a religious group that, among other things, were known for being uptight and strict. We'll go into this some more in depth later on, but essentially they thought that if you did anything for yourself, it's a sin. So if you style your hair some way, that's being selfish, that's being sinful. If you wear bright colors, that's being selfish, that's being sinful. So Puritans were known for being uptight and strict. Staple crops. Staple crops are food crops. Pretty straightforward. That's just going to be fruits, vegetables, grains, food crops. Indigo. Indigo is a flower that's used to make blue dye. So back in the day when they wanted to dye clothing, they grew these flowers. So these flowers became very, very useful and were worth quite a lot. So this is one more example of a cash crop. A debtor. Please notice the root of the word debtor is debt. And debt is money that you owe to somebody. So a debtor is somebody who owes money. And back then, but the problem with debtors is that if you couldn't pay your debts, you were thrown in prison. Which, yes, it's stupid because that means that you are in prison, you can't work, and therefore you can't pay back your debt. But that's how it works. A debtor was somebody who owed money. And lastly, representative means elected leaders. So you choose somebody to represent you. You choose somebody to speak for you in the government. So that's all the vocabulary we're going to need to know for this unit. So we're going to get started first on this page in the southern colonies. And we had previously spoken about the geography of the southern colonies. The southern colonies were known for having a hot climate and a long growing season, just like Texas. Texas has summer like 9 months out of the year. So the southern colonies were very similar to that. And then the southern colonies also had very, very fertile soil. Once again, fertile or fertile means good for growing. Now, most of the information I'm about to give you is just straight up, just facts. You don't need to try and connect these in any way. So the Virginia colony was founded in 1607. Its major settlement was Jamestown. The Maryland colony was founded in 1633. Its major settlement was Baltimore. The North Carolina colony was originally founded in 1663, as was the South Carolina colony. There was just one colony founded in 1663 called Carolina, which they then divided into North Carolina and South Carolina in 1712. North Carolina doesn't really have many prominent settlements, but South Carolina's prominent settlement is called Charleston, and it's a port city, which means that it's a city that has a harbor built around it. After that, we've got Georgia, which was founded in 1732, and its major settlement is called Savannah. And I know that a lot of you are thinking, wait, I thought Atlanta was the biggest city in Georgia. It is. But the first settlements were mostly ports because they were built around harbors. So that's it that you got to know for the southern colonies for the first part of this unit. Next up in the New England colonies. So previously we talked about the geography of the New England colonies. They were known for having a cold climate and harsh winters, along with rocky soils, but good harbors and a lot of forests. So we're going to bring all of this together in a little bit. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1620. Its big settlements were Plymouth and Boston. Connecticut was founded in the year 1639, and once again, it does not have that many big settlements, so we don't need to worry about that. Rhode Island was founded in 1647. Its major settlement is a city called Providence. You will notice that the root of the word Providence is provide. Provide means to be given, to be, given to somebody to take care of them. So the people who founded this colony of Rhode Island said that God had provided this land for them. Moving on. Working on the middle colonies page. Once again, we previously talked about the geography of the middle colonies, how they were known for having a mild climate, which again, mild means not too hot, not too cold, just kind of in the middle, like the colonies. Like the southern colonies, their geography was known for having fertile soil and rolling hills. So that's very much like the South. And then just like the North, they were known for having good harbors, just like the New England colonies. So the end result is they're kind of like the New England colonies, kind of like the Southern colonies. So just remember, the middle colonies are in the middle. New York was originally founded as New Amsterdam as a Dutch colony. So the Dutch founded it in 1647, and then the British took over it in 1663, and they renamed it New York. Its major settlement was, you guessed it, New York City. New Jersey was founded in 1664. It doesn't have very many major settlements, so you don't need to worry about it. Pennsylvania was founded in 1681. Its major settlement is Philadelphia. So that takes care of everything that you need to know when it comes to just basic facts. So we've gone over the climate and the geography for all of these colonial regions. Now we're going to go a little more in depth into how they all interact. So we're going to start over with the southern colonies. So you've got all of this information here. Now let's talk about the people who started these colonies and why these people started these colonies. So to begin with, we've got Jamestown. So the most prominent person is John Smith. A lot of you guys might remember him from that Disney Pocahontas movie. And the reason that these people started the colony at Jamestown was mostly for economic reasons. So what they did was to start this up because they wanted to make money. They started these colonies out of greed. And when they got there, they found out there was a hot climate, a long growing season, and fertile soil. So we want to make money. All of this stuff says that it's easy to grow stuff. So that means that farming is probably going to be the way to do it. But what kind of farming gets you the most money? And the answer there is cash crops. We talked about that beforehand. The idea of growing stuff so that you can sell it instead of growing stuff so that you can eat it. And the main cash crop in Jamestown was tobacco. And then we get to Maryland. Maryland is one of the rarest colonies that was started for a different reason. It was started by a guy named Cecil Calvert. That was his birth name, but he came from a very, very famous family. So he was known as Lord Baltimore. So Lord Baltimore means that he came from the famous Baltimore family. Back then, who your family was a very, very big deal. And because he started this colony, this is an example of glory. Because people would start these colonies for God, gold, and glory. So a lot of these colonies are started for gold. Cecil Calvert named the city of Baltimore after himself because you know what? That's pretty famous if you can name a colony after yourself. Unlike the rest of these, Cecil Calvert founded the colony of Maryland for religious reasons. The purpose behind that is that Catholics in England were being persecuted. So to get away from that persecution, this religious group, Catholics, left England so that they could start up a colony in North America and practice their Catholicism in peace. North Carolina doesn't have very many prominent leaders. But what you do need to know is that it was started for economic reasons. Once again, those reasons involved cash crops, and the main cash crop there was indigo. Likewise, in South Carolina, again, economic reasons they wanted to make their money growing cash crops, and specifically indigo as well as wild rice. And I know a lot of you guys are thinking, well, wait a second, wild rice isn't a cash crop; it's food. But for the most part, the people who grew the wild rice wouldn't eat it; they would sell it to somebody else. And then lastly, this one's going to be kind of confusing, and we talked about this briefly, is the colony of Georgia. So its leader was a guy named James Oglethorpe. And I always liked James Oglethorpe because it's fun to say Oglethorpe. But the main reason why he started Georgia was actually for social reasons. Where again, social does not mean friendly, social means involving people. So all of these other colonies were started for economic reasons. People wanted to make money. Some of them were started for religious reasons. People wanted to practice their religion in peace, worship God how they wanted to. In Georgia, he started it because he was specifically trying to help people. And these people were called debtors. So Georgia was founded as a safe place for debtors. So if someone was in debt to someone, back then, if you owed money, you would be thrown in jail until you paid it back, which is stupid because that's not how working works. But a lot of these jails were just full of people who owed money. So James Oglethorpe said, hey, why don't we take these people out to the New World, give them some economic opportunities, they can pay back their debts, everybody wins. So that's how James Oglethorpe started up the colony of Georgia. So one more time, all of these guys were starting up these colonies for economic reasons. When they arrived, they saw that the geography said a long growing season, very hot, fertile soil. So if you want to make money, you can make money by growing stuff. What are you going to grow? Cash crops, specifically tobacco and rice and indigo. Cotton would not be as big a deal or as favorable a cash crop until later in America's history. Moving on, in the New England colonies, the leader for the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a guy named John Winthrop, and then he and his associates started up the colony for religious reasons, specifically because the Puritans who lived over in England were being persecuted, so they said, we're going to practice our religion in peace over in North America. Likewise, in Connecticut, the person who founded the colony in Connecticut was a guy named Thomas Hooker. Go ahead. Okay. So Thomas Hooker started the colony in Connecticut, and he started this colony also for religious reasons. The difference being that he was a Puritan who was trying to escape persecution from those Puritans in Massachusetts. So, like I said, the thing about Puritans is that they are uptight and strict. They were so uptight and strict that when Thomas Hooker said, hey, I think we should do things a little differently, they kicked him and his followers out. And then they did that again in Rhode Island, where first this guy named Roger Williams and then a prominent woman named Anne Hutchinson, they said, hey, we think we should do things differently. And then all the Puritans in Massachusetts kicked them out, so they founded the colony of Rhode Island for religious reasons. Once again, they got kicked out because they were being persecuted by those other Puritans. Just remember, Puritans are uptight and strict. They want everybody to be pure. So, moving on. This brings us to the middle colonies. So, one of the most important leaders in the New York colony was a guy named Peter Stuyvesant. He was one of those Dutch founders. And he and others founded the New York colony mostly for economic reasons, for the fur trade. So you guys have seen rappers wearing these big, heavy fur coats. They do that because they're showing everybody, I've got so much money, I can wear a fur coat. And that trend goes back hundreds of years. So these people realized that, okay, fur is really, really expensive. So if we buy bunches of furs, then we can make so much money. Sir George Carteret and Lord John Berkeley, They started New Jersey once again for economic reasons, once again for the fur trade. And this is one more example of what I was talking about, how they came from famous families. So Lord John Berkeley means that he came from the famous Berkeley family. So he was Lord Berkeley. And that brings us to Pennsylvania. Once again, this is an example of glory because William Penn founded this colony and he named it after himself. Pennsylvania means Penn's forest. So William Penn founded the colony of Pennsylvania specifically for religious reasons. He belonged to a religious group called Quakers. And back in England, Quakers were being persecuted, they were being harassed, they were being punished by the government. So they said, forget this, let's just pack up and practice our religion in peace in North America. And that covers the main reasons why they all started here. Now, one more time, one more time, the middle colonies are kind of in the middle. New England colonies were mostly founded for religious reasons. The southern colonies were mostly founded for economic reasons. And the middle colonies are a little bit of both. But one more time, they arrived here, they were looking to make money. They were looking to practice their religion in peace. They arrive, they find a mild climate, not too hot, not too cold, fertile soil, rolling hills, a lot of rivers, and a lot of harbors. So putting all of that together, they started growing what are called staple crops. And staple crops means food crops. For example, fruit, vegetables, and grain. And grain. So grains are going to be the kind of thing that you use to make bread. So wheat and oats. If you need help remembering this, just remember, these colonies are called the breadbasket colonies. And one of the key ingredients in bread is oats. The most famous brand of oats is Quaker Oats, because this is where that company was started. But putting all of this together, they wound up growing some staple crops and livestock, which again means live animals, cows, pigs, that kind of stuff. But then they also have rivers and harbors, so they're going to have a lot of shipping and a lot of the fur trade. So one more time, the middle colonies, they're in the middle. The southern colonies are mostly going to be farming kind of economies, whereas the New England colonies are mostly going to be shipping economies. And the middle colonies, a little bit of both. And then that brings us back to the southern colonies, so let's put them all together. So, as we had previously mentioned, most of these colonies were started for economic reasons. Everybody started these colonies because they wanted to make it rich. They were greedy. So once they started these colonies, they found out there's a hot climate, a long growing season, fertile soil. So they say, okay, that's good for farming. The best way to make money off of farming is to farm cash crops. Tobacco, rice, indigo, cotton, all of these are examples of cash crops. And that brings us to what happened in 1619, which again, this is kind of a perfect example of what social studies is talking about. It is the best that America has to offer, and it is also the worst. Because in 1619, we have the House of Burgesses, which was the first representative self-government. This was the first time in North America that the citizens of a colony said, I want this guy to be in charge. Before this, the king said, this guy's in charge, do what he says. But now people are starting their own governments and they are choosing the people who are going to govern them. That's a big deal. That's a good thing. However, 1619 was also the arrival of the first African slaves. Like I said, the people who started up these colonies, they were greedy, they wanted to make money, they didn't care how. So they had these very, very large farms, and on these very, very large farms, they had several African slaves. Once again, this is what social studies is. The best parts of America and the worst parts of America. Because previously we talked about how Catholics were trying to escape persecution, Puritans were trying to escape persecution, Quakers were trying to escape persecution. Well, in 1649 in the southern colonies, they passed the Toleration Act, which was the first law of religious tolerance. So it basically said any Christian can practice their religion in peace. So it's not any religion, Jews and Muslims and Hindus were not allowed to practice their religion. However, it was a first step towards greater religious tolerance and greater religious freedom among citizens. So, once again, some of the best of what America has to offer, and also some of the worst, because what were the purpose of slave codes? Well, slave codes were laws meant to control slaves. The point was to try and prevent slave uprisings. So to keep that from happening, slaves were not allowed to meet with each other, and slaves were not allowed to have weapons. Basically a slave could use uh, a rake or a garden hoe, and then it had to be taken back and locked up. So that's what slave codes mean, and that is central to the Southern economy. And as a result, that influence is still being felt today. As a matter of fact, some people are talking about an idea called the 1619 Project to talk about the history of slavery in North America. Moving on. So, two things that are significant about the year 1620. Well, we previously established that that's when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded. So that was the first colony in New England. And it was also the signing of the Mayflower Compact. Now, why do we care about the Mayflower Compact? What is the Mayflower Compact? The answer is that the Mayflower Compact is the first written constitution in North America. The first time everybody got together, sat down, and they wrote up a plan of government. And everybody signed it, and everybody abides by it. This is important because if I say something that is wrong in class, you should be able to pick up your textbook and say, no, look at this. You see this book right here? You're wrong. And that's the entire point behind a constitution. A constitution is a document that establishes a system of government. And that way, if somebody breaks the law, you can hold up this document and say, no, see that? You're wrong. You're breaking the law. So having our first constitution in North America is a very important first step. Now, as I previously mentioned, Puritans were uptight and strict, but they came here because they were escaping persecution in England. So how were women treated in Plymouth differently than women in England? Well, generally, they had more rights. So if a woman was not allowed to own property just by herself, but if a woman was married to a man and that man died, she could hold on to that property. A widow was allowed to own property. Women were allowed to sue in court in Plymouth, and they weren't allowed to do that in England. Women were allowed to sign contracts, which they weren't allowed to do in England. So as you can see, there is a lot more freedom. So first of all, Puritans are escaping persecution from England. We're going to have our first constitution in North America, and women are given more rights in North America. So this is a trend, and the more freedom people get in North America, the more they are going to want. And we'll come back to that some more in our next unit. How are the government and religion related? As I had previously mentioned, Puritans wanted everybody to be pure. So they were very, very uptight, and they were very, very strict. So if you styled your hair a specific way, that's being selfish, that's being sinful. If you wore bright colors, that was being selfish, that was being sinful. And because they started this colony, because they wanted to practice their religion, that meant that the government was involved with the church, and the church was involved with the government. So that means that if you skipped church one weekend, you lost your right to vote. That's how tightly the government and the church were involved. But that also means that any sin was also a crime and would be punished like that. So that could be a bit of an issue. How would you guys feel if I were to say to you guys, okay, you're styling your hair a specific way because you think it looks good. That's selfish, that's sinful, so your punishment is we're going to cut your hair off, all of it. Your clothing is brightly colored and it's super expensive. That's selfish. That's sinful. So your punishment is that we are going to burn all of your clothing, and the only thing you'll be allowed to wear is basically a brown paper bag. So that's what I mean when I say that the government was involved with the church was involved with the government, and any sin was a crime. And that brings us finally to the middle colonies. So, as I had previously mentioned, the Quakers were trying to escape religious persecution over in England. They were a different religious group. They had a different set, excuse me, they had a different set of beliefs from the Puritans. Quakers actually were pretty cool and pretty advanced for their day. They believed in equality, total equality. So that meant racial equality, gender equality, equality of age. Children had the same rights as old men. Women had the same rights as men. Natives had the same rights as Africans, had the same rights as Europeans. Total equality. So I always told my students that we love Quakers because they believed in total equality of everybody. However, one of the reasons why a lot of my students didn't like Quakers is that they believed in pacifism, and pacifism means non-violence. So that means if the government is oppressing you, you can leave, but you can't fight back. And so a lot of people did not care for that. So, one more time, because they believed in racial equality, a lot of women in the middle colonies contributed to the economy by running some businesses. Businesses back then were usually fairly small time sort of thing, like clothing stores or grocery stores or bakeries or small businesses like that. Mostly women ran households. They raised children, washed, cooked, cleaned, etc., etc., etc. So that concludes our summary of the graphic organizer for the founding of the 13 colonies. I know that it's a lot, but as I was trying to point out to you guys, everything intersects. Everything makes more sense. So I hope that was helpful, and we're going to be talking about this a lot more moving forward. Thanks a lot.